Have you ever felt guilty for wanting financial stability? Have you ever wondered whether pursuing success somehow made you less spiritual? For centuries, millions of people have read one sentence from Jesus and concluded that money itself was the enemy. But what if that was never his message? What if one untranslated Aramaic word completely changed the meaning of one of the most quoted passages in the Bible? Today, we are returning to the original language spoken by Jesus during the Sermon on the Mount to uncover a word that survived the translation into Greek but gradually lost its true depth. By the end of this video, you may never read Matthew 6:24 the same way again, because the issue was never money itself, was something far more subtle, far more powerful, and far more dangerous. The verse everyone thinks they already understand. One of the most frequently quoted teachings of Jesus appears in the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew chapter 6. Many believers can recite it from memory. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money. Because these words have been repeated for generations, they often pass without question. Most people assume the meaning is obvious. If money is mentioned alongside God, then money must be the problem. Yet this conclusion has shaped the spiritual lives of countless people, often producing fear, guilt, or even suspicion toward prosperity itself. Look closely at the broader context of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is speaking about the condition of the human heart. Just before this passage, he teaches about storing treasures, the direction of the eyes, and the inner focus that determines a person's entire life. Then, immediately afterward, he speaks about anxiety, worrying over food, clothing, and tomorrow. Every teaching surrounding this famous verse concerns trust, priorities, and the orientation of the soul. Suddenly, the discussion becomes much larger than financial possessions. Now comes the surprising discovery. The word translated as money in many modern Bibles was never an ordinary Aramaic word for coins or currency. In fact, Jesus used a very specific expression that carried a much richer meaning. Even when the Gospels were written in Greek, the translators did not replace this word with the Greek word for money. Instead, they preserved its sound, writing it as mammonas, because they recognized it represented something unique. Behind that Greek spelling stood the original Aramaic word. Mammon, pronunciation mamona, meaning wealth, possessions, or whatever becomes your object of trust. Notice something extraordinary. If the earliest Gospel writers preserved the original word instead of translating it, perhaps they understood that no single Greek term could capture everything Jesus intended. Somewhere along the centuries, however, readers gradually began treating mamona as if it simply meant money. A profound spiritual concept became reduced to a financial object. That small shift changed the way millions interpreted the teaching of Jesus. Instead of asking, what does mamona really represent? People started asking, is money sinful? The conversation moved away from the heart and toward possessions. Yet that was never the emphasis surrounding this passage. Imagine two people with exactly the same amount of wealth. One uses resources generously, serves others, remains humble, and sees every blessing as a stewardship. The other lives in constant fear of losing everything, measures personal worth by possessions, and believes security depends entirely upon accumulation. Outwardly, they may look similar, but inwardly they serve two completely different masters. This is precisely why the original Aramaic matters. Jesus was not introducing an economic principle before speaking about anxiety. He was exposing the invisible force that quietly captures the human heart long before anyone notices it. And to understand that force, we must first understand what mamona truly meant in the language he actually spoke. If this teaching has opened a new perspective for you, our Aramaic Wisdom Guide can help you continue this journey. After all, true knowledge sets us free. You'll find the link in the comments. Mamona was never just money. If mamona did not simply mean money, then what did Jesus actually mean? To answer that question, we need to step back into the world where he lived and taught. In 1st century Aramaic, pronounced mamona referred to wealth, possessions, resources, or property. But the word carried an even deeper layer. It described that in which a person placed confidence, dependence, and security. It was not merely what someone owned. It was what someone trusted. This is why translating the words simply as money narrows the meaning dramatically. Jesus was speaking about the object that quietly becomes a person's source of identity. That object could certainly include wealth, but its true power lay in the loyalty it demanded. Think about the difference. Money is simply a tool. Like water, it can nourish life or cause destruction depending on how it is used. A coin cannot command your heart. A bank account cannot force you to abandon compassion. Yet trust can. Confidence misplaced can. The illusion that possessions guarantee peace can. This is where mamona becomes far more than an economic concept. It becomes a spiritual rival. It promises certainty without faith, control without surrender, and security without God. That promise is what Jesus was exposing during the Sermon on the Mount. This understanding also explains why his teaching flows naturally into his next words. Do not worry about your life. Seek first the kingdom. Notice the progression. First, he warns against serving Mammon. Then, he addresses anxiety. Finally, he points his listeners toward the kingdom. These are not separate subjects. They form one continuous message. Whenever trust shifts toward possessions, worry inevitably follows. The more we depend upon external security, the more frightened we become of losing it. Fear grows, because the foundation itself is fragile. Imagine a traveler crossing a desert carrying two water skins. One contains fresh water, the other is filled with sand painted blue to resemble water. From a distance, they appear identical. Only when thirst comes does the difference become obvious. Mamona works in much the same way. It offers the appearance of security, yet when life becomes uncertain, it cannot provide the peace it promised. It cannot heal grief. It cannot restore broken relationships. It cannot calm a fearful heart at midnight. It can purchase comfort, but it cannot create lasting peace. That is why Jesus never described wealth as evil. Throughout the scriptures, we find faithful men and women who possessed great resources while remaining devoted to God. Their possessions were not their master because their trust rested elsewhere. The issue was never what filled their hands. The issue was what ruled their hearts. The danger of mamona begins the moment possessions stop being servants and quietly become masters. Perhaps this explains why so many people work harder than ever, earn more than ever, and yet feel less secure than ever. The problem is not necessarily financial. It is spiritual. When identity becomes attached to accumulation, no amount is ever enough. Every achievement demands another. Every gain creates another fear of loss. Jesus recognized this cycle nearly 2,000 years ago, and he named it with one unforgettable Aramaic word that still speaks directly to our modern lives, the great Mistranslation that changed Christian thinking. Imagine hearing Jesus speak these words in Aramaic on the hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. His listeners would not have pictured coins falling onto the ground or merchants counting silver. They would have understood that he was describing something capable of capturing the deepest loyalty of the human heart. That is why the earliest gospel writers chose not to replace the word with an ordinary Greek equivalent. Instead, they preserved its sound as mammonas, acknowledging that the original expression carried a meaning too rich to be reduced to a single translation. Over the centuries, however, something subtle happened. As the scriptures were translated into more languages, many versions rendered mamona simply as money or wealth. Although understandable from a linguistic perspective, this simplification unintentionally shifted the emphasis of the passage. Readers gradually concluded that the warning itself was directed against money. An entire generation of believers began to associate financial success with spiritual danger, even though that was never the central point of the teaching. This misunderstanding has influenced countless lives. Some have believed that seeking financial stability was incompatible with faith. Others have carried unnecessary guilt simply because they desired to provide well for their families. Perhaps you're wondering why these original teachings remained hidden for so long. That's why we created the Aramaic Wisdom Guide. Because true knowledge sets us free. The link is waiting for you in the comments. Still others assumed that poverty itself was somehow a sign of greater holiness. Yet none of these conclusions naturally emerge when the original Aramaic concept is restored. Jesus was not glorifying lack, nor condemning honest prosperity. He was revealing that anything trusted more than God eventually becomes a master. Think again about his exact words. No one can serve two masters. Notice that he begins with the idea of service before mentioning mamona. Service implies loyalty, devotion, obedience, and dependence. A master is not defined by what he owns. He is defined by the authority he exercises. That observation changes everything. Mamona becomes dangerous only when it begins exercising authority over decisions, emotions, relationships, and identity. The issue is not the existence of wealth, but the direction of devotion. This also explains why people with very little money can still serve mamona. Someone does not need to be wealthy to become consumed by fear, comparison, envy, or obsession with possessions. Likewise, a generous person entrusted with great resources may remain completely free, because those resources never define who they are. The battle described by Jesus takes place long before numbers appear in a bank account. It begins wherever the human heart decides where ultimate security will be found. Perhaps the most liberating realization is this: Jesus never asked his followers to fear money. He invited them to examine what they trusted. The difference is enormous. One message produces guilt. The other produces freedom. One encourages people to avoid prosperity out of fear. The other teaches them to handle every blessing without allowing it to become their identity. When the original Aramaic word is restored, the teaching regains its remarkable balance. Wealth becomes a tool rather than a master. Resources become opportunities for stewardship rather than measures of personal worth. And the focus returns to exactly where Jesus intended it, to buy from external possessions back to the inner condition of the heart. What Jesus wanted you to serve instead. If Jesus was not teaching people to fear money, then what was he inviting them to pursue? The answer appears immediately after his warning about mamona. He says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness." This is not a change of subject. It is the solution to everything he has just explained. Once the illusion of mamona is exposed, Jesus redirects his listeners toward a completely different foundation. Instead of placing confidence in possessions, he calls them to place their confidence in God's kingdom, a kingdom that cannot be shaken by markets, circumstances, or uncertainty. Notice the beautiful contrast. Mamona promises security by accumulation. The kingdom offers security through relationship with God. Mamona says, "You are what you own." The kingdom says, "You are a beloved child before you possess anything." These two voices compete for the same place within the human heart. That is why Jesus described them as two masters. Both ask for trust, but only one can truly sustain life. This teaching also explains why some people remain peaceful during financial hardship, while others remain anxious despite great wealth. The difference is rarely found in the size of their resources. It is found in the location of their confidence. When peace depends entirely on external circumstances, every unexpected expense becomes a crisis. But when trust is rooted in God, resources become blessings to manage rather than idols to protect. The gospel never teaches believers to reject honest work, generosity, or responsible stewardship. On the contrary, Jesus often praised faithful management and compassionate use of resources. The warning is directed toward the heart that slowly begins believing wealth can replace faith. That substitution happens quietly. It rarely announces itself. It simply shifts attention away from God until possessions become the measure of success, safety, and significance. Perhaps that is why this ancient Aramaic word still speaks so powerfully today. The world continues promising that happiness is only one promotion, one investment, or one purchase away. Yet Jesus gently reminds us that peace cannot be bought because it was never for sale. Real security begins where trust returns to God, allowing every material blessing to become a servant instead of a master. A daily practice to stay free from mamona. Understanding the meaning of mamona is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when this truth becomes part of daily life. Every morning presents a quiet choice. Will today's decisions be guided by fear or by trust? Will success determine your identity, or will your identity shape the way you handle success? These questions may seem simple, yet they reveal which master is influencing the heart. A practical way to begin is by examining your first reaction whenever financial pressure appears. Do you immediately feel panic, believing everything depends upon your own strength? Or do you pause, remembering the words of Jesus, that the Father already knows what you need. This moment of reflection interrupts the voice of mamona, replacing anxiety with conscious trust. It does not ignore responsibility. Instead, it restores the proper order: faith first, action second. Another powerful practice is gratitude. Gratitude reminds us that every resource is ultimately a gift to steward rather than a possession that defines us. Whether our hands hold little or much, giving thanks shifts attention away from scarcity and back toward God's faithfulness. It weakens the constant desire for more and strengthens contentment without removing healthy ambition. Generosity also becomes a quiet declaration of freedom. Every act of kindness reminds the heart that resources are meant to flow, not to become chains. When we can bless others without fear, we demonstrate that our confidence no longer rests in accumulation. Wealth returns to its rightful place as a tool instead of an identity. This is the invitation hidden within the original Aramaic word, mamona. Jesus was not asking his followers to fear prosperity. He was teaching them never to surrender their hearts to anything that promises security apart from God. That lesson remains just as relevant today as it was on the hillside where the Sermon on the Mount was first spoken. And when we remember it each day, money becomes a faithful servant, while God remains the only true master. Conclusion. Today, we return to one of the most familiar sayings of Jesus, only to discover that one original Aramaic word changes the way the entire passage is understood. Mamona was never simply about money. It was about misplaced trust. The warning was not directed at honest work, responsible stewardship, or financial provision. It was directed at the subtle moment when possessions begin to define identity, security, and hope. That is why this teaching remains so relevant today. Every generation must decide what it will ultimately trust. The invitation of Jesus is remarkably freeing. You do not have to reject resources in order to follow God. You do not have to feel guilty for providing for your family or building something meaningful. Instead, you are invited to keep every blessing in its proper place. Let your resources serve your purpose, but never allow them to become your master. When trust remains anchored in God, prosperity can become a channel of generosity rather than a source of fear. This week, take a few quiet moments each morning before beginning your day. Repeat this simple reflection: Lord, may my confidence rest in you, not in what I possess. Let every resource you place in my hands become a tool for good, never the foundation of my identity. It is a simple practice, but over time, it gently retrains the heart to seek the kingdom before everything else. If this message helped you see the words of Jesus in a new light, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who has always believed that faith and financial blessing could never walk together. Join the hundreds of students already practicing the original Aramaic through our study guides. The link is in the first pinned comment. If today's message helped you see the words of Jesus in a completely new way, write mamona in the comments. Let it be your reminder that your trust belongs to God, while money remains only a tool. As you see others writing mamona, take a moment to encourage them. We'd grow stronger when we rediscover these ancient teachings together. Until next time, may your heart remain free, your trust remain unshaken, and may the wisdom of Jesus continue to illuminate your path.